The walls were the colour of cobalt sky, saturated and bold, even in the early light. They wrapped around the garden like arms, enclosing ferns, along with the occasional parrot, and all entrenched with Frida's childhood memories. It was a house built with symmetry, but lived in unevenly. A house with windows that watched more than they offered view. In Coyoacan, where the air could be thick with sun or soaked with rain, La Casa Azul stood slightly apart, not because of its colour, though that did help, but because of how it seemed to absorb those inside of it. A quiet gravity. Years later, Frida would live there as a woman with corsets and brushes and guests who drank too much mezcal, but long before all of that, she was simply a girl trying to outrun something unnamed. Welcome to Sleepy Archives, a podcast that walks us through the lives of people who have helped to shape the cultural landscape we find ourselves in today. This evening's story will take us to Mexico, where we'll observe the story of beauty, of rebellion and pain, surrounding one of the world's most influential historical artists, Frida Kahlo. Her name holds a profound complexity that only her work could articulate. Work that would become symbolic of womanhood, humanity, and of grief. Let's get into the story. Her full name was Magdalena Carmen Frida Kahlo y Calderon. She was born on the 6th of July, 1907, though later in life she would claim 1910 instead, aligning her own arrival with the birth of modern Mexico, the start of the revolution. It wasn't quite accurate, but she didn't mind bending the truth if it let her live more symbolically. Her father, Guillermo Carlo, was a German immigrant with Hungarian Jewish ancestry, a photographer by trade. He was meticulous, patient, but distant. In Frida's memory, though, he was warm in his own language, the quiet language of observation. He taught her about light and structure, how to read sky patterns, and how to survive solitude. He'd suffered from epilepsy for much of his life, and in her childhood illness, Frida found herself tethered to him in an unspoken way. They both understood what it meant to live inside a fragile body. Her mother, Matilde Calderon, was born to Spanish and indigenous parents. Stern and devout, she held the house together with precision and prayer. Frida would later call her intelligent but cold. There was a current between them, sharp and somewhat unresolved. This dynamic would remain until the end. The household was a blend of stillness and intensity. There were sisters, half-siblings, servants, and saints on the walls. Daily life followed a Catholic rhythm, but Frida watched everything with a questioning eye. Even then, she was drawn toward contradiction, the beautiful and grotesque, the scared and irreverent. She'd read medical texts before bedtime and collect odd bones from the garden like they were treasure. At 6, polio entered her life. Her right leg withered and her gait changed. The illness kept her out of school for months, and she was left with a slight limp, something other children mocked. Her father took her walking, then swimming, and then boxing, anything to build up her strength. She responded without self-pity, but with defiance. She wore long skirts to cover the imbalance and developed a kind of seductive charisma early, a wit sharpened by her pain. By the time she was admitted to the National Preparatory School in 1922, she was one of only 35 girls among 2,000 students. The school itself was a microcosm of post-revolutionary ideals, a place where history was being rewritten in murals and lectures, and where youth could imagine themselves as agents of a newly forming nation. Mexico was trying to remember itself. Indigenous traditions, colonial past, and revolutionary hope all pulling in different directions. She fell in with a group of intellectual troublemakers who called themselves the Chachuas. They wore caps, staged pranks, and quoted Marx. Frida, with her deep-set eyes and cutting humour, held her own in every room. She could mimic teachers, challenge classmates, and also write poetry veering from romantic to distorted in a single line. Her political ideologies began forming here, though they didn't yet have structure. She was anti-authoritarian and instinctively drawn to the left. Nationalism was in the air, and Frida took pride in being mestiza, a blend of Spanish and indigenous blood. At school, she would pass murals in progress, Diego Rivera among them, massive in stature and reputation. He was painting Mexican history across walls, turning politics into fresco. She watched him from afar. He did not yet know her name, not for a few more years. It was September 17th, 1925, and Frida was 17. She was riding in a wooden bus with her friend Alejandro Gomez Arias, returning from school when the bus collided with a streetcar. The impact was violent. A metal handrail pierced her pelvis. Her spine broke in multiple places. Her collarbone, ribs, right leg, and foot were all fractured, and her abdomen was torn open. The scene was nearly fatal. Someone spilled gold dust from a nearby cart, and it clung to her bleeding body. Glittering against the trauma. Later, it would be remembered like a surrealist painting. She should not have survived, but she did. She was taken to the Red Cross Hospital in Mexico City. Her recovery would span years, dozens of operations, plaster corsets, extended isolation. The physical agony was only part of it. Her dreams, now changed. Her future, once imagined in medicine, fell away. In the long stretch of her recovery, a mirror was affixed to the canopy of her bed. Someone brought her paints. She began to look closely at her own face. It was a face she already knew well, But now it became a canvas, a battleground even, and most certainly a diary. Her first self-portraits were direct, and sometimes she painted herself crying, other times with a monkey or a thorn necklace, an open wound. However, always with truth. She once wrote, "I paint myself because I am so often alone, and because I am the subject I know best." The girl who had wandered barefoot through the garden, who had danced despite a limp, who had memorized anatomy for fun. She was beginning to turn herself inside out with brushes instead of words. Her body, once the site of secrecy and shame, became central to her vision, and from her bed she could still hear the house, Mathilde's footsteps, Guillemero's cough, the servants moving in the kitchen, birds fighting in the trees, but the centre of her world had completely changed. Recovery had no rhythm. There were days that slid by quietly, almost gently, and others that arrived jagged, no warning or mercy. Her body had been broken in places even doctors didn't fully understand, and they spoke in numbers: ribs, vertebrae, centimetres of bone that would never meet again. But Frida wasn't tracking the damage. She was watching time behave differently, stretched out and condensed, and sometimes so still it stopped. She was flat on her back in a hospital bed, then later in her childhood bedroom at Casa Azul. The ceilings she had never really looked at before now became landmarks, and so did the shadows on the walls, the marks left by shoes at the bases of furniture, and the scent of damp linen. There were mirrors, and there were corsets, one stiff with plaster, another leather-bound like armour. It took hours to move, and most of that effort wasn't physical, it was a negotiation, because pain had become a full-time presence. It didn't always scream, it often whispered. There were mirrors, and there were also corsets, one stiff with plaster, another leather-bound like armour. It took hours to move, and most of that effort wasn't physical. It was a negotiation, because pain had become a full-time presence within her. It didn't always scream, but it whispered, and it was constant and intimate. Her younger sister, Christina, always trying to help without crowding her. Alejandro also came often in the early months, sweet and uncertain, still dressed in schoolboy collars and caught somewhere between guilt and longing. He had affection for her, and she him, but it shifted under the weight of everything. At 17, Frida had become someone else. The act of painting ended quietly. Her parents, sensing she needed something to fill the endless days, arranged for an easel that could be adjusted to lie flat. A mirror was then mounted overhead, and paints left within reach. No one made a declaration about creativity or healing. They just left it there, a set of tools. Frida didn't speak much about it at first. She just began. Her first paintings were restrained, portraits of herself and of family, and of quiet objects that didn't move. But even in her early work, there was stillness. It didn't quite feel passive. Her gaze was always direct, and her framing personal. She wasn't trying to flatter. but trying to see. The pain didn't soften, but it did shift. Less of a scream, more of a second skin. She painted not because it distracted her from suffering, but because it helped her locate it, gave it structure, gave it colour and place. She once wrote to Alejandro, "My blood is a miracle that, from my veins, crosses the air in my heart into yours." Her letters during that time were filled with fragments like that, poetic, wounded, tender in places she rarely let others see. She had always been a performer of sorts, but when she wrote from bed, nothing was staged. She was just trying to stay in motion, mentally. Some days she sketched bones, anatomical studies copied from medical books. Other days she drew her corset or the needle mark on her thighs. She didn't romanticize her newfound body, but made it legible. The line between life and art, between sensation and image, was already blurring in her artistic development. When visitors came, they rarely stayed long. It wasn't easy to know what to say to a girl whose whole future had been dismantled, then half stitched back together with gauze and metal. Her sense of humour remained intact, sharper in some ways. She could be viciously funny about the doctors, about her scars, and the fact she had a new relationship with gravity and silence. There was grief, of course, but she didn't call it that. The plan to study medicine was gone. The independence she fought for evaporated. She was still living under her parents' roof in her girlhood bed, surrounded by family expectations and the smell of boiled broth. What emerged during that time wasn't a new version of Frida exactly. It was a more concentrated one, because everything had sharpened: her awareness of pain, the scrutiny of her own image. She also strengthened her rejection of pity. She painted herself again and again, sometimes including symbols, a broken column, bleeding roots, insects, thorns. But the expression was almost always the same: neutral and watchful. She never asked for sympathy, but she was documenting her newfound experience. One of the earliest self-portraits, painted in 1926, shows her in a red silk blouse, her face solemn, her features exacting. It's careful, but not too hesitant. She meets the viewer's gaze head on with certainty, like she knows she will be studied, and chooses to control what you see. That self-awareness would become a kind of armor. Over time, her image would be reproduced endlessly on postcards, textbooks, on tote bags. But here, in the stillness of her recovery, she was making herself known on her own terms. Because no one was commissioning these works. They came from necessity. There were other things happening too, things she didn't speak of aloud, desire that didn't follow the rules. Affection for women that lived quietly between letters and glances. She'd always been drawn towards intensity, and gender rarely felt like a dividing line. Her body was fractured, yes, but her interior life remained vivid and unruly. Some of that made it into her sketches, and some stayed private in her letters, tucked away under her mattress. As months passed, she learned to walk again. The limp remained, and so did the pain. She began to wear her long skirts again, mostly out of tradition at first, but also because she realised they gave her power. She once again began to wear her long skirts, mostly out of tradition at first, but also because she realised they gave her power. She could dress as she pleased, cloak what she chose to, and exaggerate what mattered. It was aesthetic, yes, but also political. The body had betrayed her, and now she would decide how it would be seen. By the time she was 19, she was back on her feet, painting steadily and considering, quietly and not yet with ambition, the possibility that art might be more than recovery, that it might be a language, one perhaps she already spoke. This man, she had seen him before, years earlier on scaffolding, high above the tiled floors of her school. His body large, and the folds of his clothing stained with pigment. He moved like someone who didn't care to be watched. And he was always being watched. Back then, Diego Rivera was already more than a painter. He was a noisy myth with a large appetite. His murals rippled with revolution and smoke, labourers and goddesses, clenched fists and ancient gods. Mexico, broken and rebuilding, was being reimagined on his walls. Frida had walked past one of them on her way to class, unimpressed. She was still a schoolgirl back then, with scraped shoes and a sense of mischief blanketed by indifference. She rolled her eyes at his fame, mimicked his mannerisms with her friends. But she remembered him. By the time she approached him in 1928, she was no longer performing rebellion in classrooms. She was recovering from it in her own body. Her paintings had grown in number and in confidence, still small in scale, still often self-contained, but different for sure. More precise and less concerned with flattery, they held a steady fire that ran through the Stokes she'd chosen. She found him at the Ministry of Public Education, where he was working on a new mural. She brought 4 of her paintings with her, tucked under her arm, and asked him directly what he thought. As an equal, or close enough to pretend. He studied them carefully, asked questions, then told her flatly that she had something rare. He offered no empty praise. He said what mattered, that she should keep painting, and that he wanted to see her again. They began spending time together, sometimes alone, but often in the boisterous rooms of Mexico's intellectual left. Parties spilled out of apartments into city streets, while conversations moved from politics to poetry to gossip and cycling back once again. Fueled with tequila and raised voices from passion, Diego was at the centre of it all. Frida, however, began naturally forming her own orbit that had a unique pull. Diego was 20 years older, divorced, and infamous for his romantic chaos and personal excess. He ate messily, drank heavily, and some would say spoke too loudly. He could be cruel without noticing, generous without warning. None of this seemed to trouble Frida. She could match him for intellect and push back when he became careless. He didn't frighten her. After all, she had lived through worse. They fell into something that resembled love, intense and elastic, but their pairing was threaded with polarizing peaks and troughs, admiration and pain, from the start. Her mother called it a marriage between an elephant and a dove. The proportions weren't just physical. Diego consumed space. Frida, in contrast, compressed meaning into small corners. They married in 1929. Her parents disapproved. Her father, privately, thought Diego too wild. Her mother, openly found him unbearable. But Frida didn't ask for their approval. She had grown up inside a household of tensions and made peace with disappointment. What she wanted now was movement. They moved to Cuernavaca for Diego's work. The city sat in the mountains. Slower and more lush than Mexico City, it was threaded with cobbled streets and flowers that spilled over stone walls. The heat pressed in gently during the day, but lifted by the evening. There was a church nearby that rang its bells at irregular intervals, and a courtyard where Frida watched lizards sunbathe while she drank strong coffee in the mornings. At first, she welcomed the change. The quiet was new and unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. She painted again, small studies of plants, of herself, of the volcanoes that framed the landscape. Her palette during this period darkened slightly, but her line became more certain. There was something about the isolation that forced her deeper into herself, but the adjustment was uneasy. She was still recovering physically and emotionally. Her body gave her no consistency. Some days were tolerable, and others full of sharp, inexplicable pain. And while Diego was technically there, he wasn't with her. He was absorbed in his commissions, his letters, the steady stream of comrades and colleagues who passed through their home. There were long evenings where he didn't come to bed, long mornings where he barely spoke. Frida had grown up in a house that ran on structure and surveillance. Now, she lived in a house where silence could mean absence or indifference, and she couldn't always tell the difference. She loved Diego, that much was certain, but she was beginning to understand that loving him would not protect her from loneliness. She read constantly, wrote letters home, and sat by open windows, studying the way the light hit the stone. She tried not to keep track of his mood. When he did give her his attention, it was full, often affectionate, sometimes overwhelming, but it never lasted too long. She was learning the rhythm of Diego's life, bursts of passion followed by disappearance. Then came the invitations to the United States. In 1930, they sailed to San Francisco. It was the first of several long stays abroad. Diego was celebrated there. Murals, lectures, introductions to the American elite. Frida, meanwhile, observed everything with a kind of half-amused detachment. She found the American obsession with success both hollow and fascinating. She called the country Gringolandia. She learned to pose in photographs while thinking about other things. In her letters home, she described the streets, the clothes, the strange silences as something more than just foreign. She deeply missed Mexico, and constantly. She missed the heat and the chaos, the language, the way people told the truth without trying to dress it up. Detroit then followed. After that, New York. These cities became chapters in her marriage, but also in her illness. Her health faltered throughout the early 30s. She suffered a miscarriage in Detroit in 1932, and it nearly killed her. The physical pain was immense, but it was also the emotional dislocation that undid her. She had wanted that child. She had imagined a new kind of relationship with her body. Instead, she was alone in a hospital room, bleeding into sheets, while Diego, still consumed by his work. She painted the loss, plainly. Henry Ford Hospital shows her naked on a blood-stained bed, surrounded by objects. A fetus, a snail, medical equipment, a cracked pelvis. It's brutal and it's honest. Made in the middle of grief and not after it. This wasn't how women painted at the time, not in the public eye, and yet Frida had no intention of hiding. Her work had no filter for politeness. She wasn't interested in whether the images disturbed people. If anything, she welcomed the discomfort. She also painted her own birth, another taboo. She painted her relationship with her mother, her pain, her doubts, her body in endless states of rupture. These weren't symbolic wounds either, but real documentations that belonged to her. Diego didn't always understand. He admired her work deeply and encouraged her to exhibit, but he sometimes dismissed it as too small and too personal. Frida knew better. She wasn't looking to fill murals. She was trying to paint without distance. Diego, so used to the brash and literal, was unfamiliar with the nuanced politics Frida's work held, and they were political. By the time they had reached New York in 1933, things between them had grown strained. Diego had accepted a commission to paint a mural at Rockefeller Center, but refused to remove the image of Lenin. The mural was destroyed. It was a scandal, and he was fired. Frida, watching the events unfold, admired his defiance, but also saw the cost. They returned to Mexico not long after. Frida was changed. Her experiences abroad had clarified something. She saw how she was viewed, as exotic and decorative, as the painter's dramatic wife. Yes, she hated it. However, she also saw how she could use it. The Tijuana dresses, the embroidered blouses, the jewelry, had become a strategy. She began dressing with intention, performing her identity on her own terms. If the world wanted to see a myth, she would give them one, but one she had written, and under the fabric, under the costume, the paint kept flowing and flowing. They returned without ceremony or fanfare, but with a tired kind of homecoming that follows a big disruption. It was late in 1933. Frida was 26, and Mexico felt different. She had spent so long measuring herself against foreignness, the cold reserve of American drawing rooms, the empty deference of collectors, the sterile smile of hospital corridors, that returning gave her a lightness she had once cherished. The streets were chaotic again and familiar. She understood how to move through them with ease. The vendors, the language, the pace of light across the late afternoon. She fell back into a contented rhythm her body had been craving. They moved into a new house in San Angel, a modernist structure split into two adjoining buildings, one red, one blue, connected by a footbridge. It had been designed by the architect Juan O'Gorman. Two lives, built side by side, with just enough distance between them. It was practical. Frida lived in the blue house and Diego in the red. They kept separate studios, separate bedrooms, and the footbridge allowed for closeness when it was wanted, but silence when it wasn't. She called it a marriage of two volcanoes, each within their own ecosystem, and each with their own eruptions. She painted steadily. The scale of her work remained small, but the subject matter expanded. Her face, again and again, in various states of pain, solitude, and clarity. Religious symbolism began to slowly seep its way into her compositions. She'd grown up with Catholic iconography on the walls, saints looking down from niches. Now she borrowed from those images halos, hearts pierced with nails, martyrdom rendered in fine brushwork. Endless articles and essays discussing the presence of religious symbolism in Kahlo's work and her personal connection to spirituality are still being published today. Whether taken from familiarity or embedded with something deeper, Frida's self confessed connection to the universe as unseen was vast, and if we view her pieces through that lens, I'm sure the objects in question are not just for aesthetics. There was a piece she painted that year. My dress hangs there. She'd started this piece during her time in New York and finished it back home. The dress, Tehuana, was traditional, but it hung empty. It was suspended in mid-air against the chaos of American capitalism. A jumble of smokestacks, dollar signs, skyscrapers, and factories crowded the background. In the foreground, a toilet and a trophy. No single target or fixed critique, just the discomfort of being an outsider handed a pedestal she hadn't asked for. The image was quiet but unmistakable. Her disillusionment had settled into clarity. Politics filled the house, gave it texture. Conversations over dinner, newspapers marked up with pencil, and names whispered or celebrated depending on the moment, were constant. Both Frida and Diego were now members of the Communist Party, though her alignment was more instinctive than academic. She was drawn to resistance, to anyone who had survived rupture. The ideology mattered, but the people mattered more. In 1937, the House took on a new role. Leon Trotsky, exiled from the Soviet Union and hunted by Stalin, had arrived in Mexico. Diego had helped arrange his asylum. Trotsky and his wife Natalia moved into La Casa Azul, which Frida had reclaimed from her family by then. The blue walls were still intact, and so was the garden, the parrots, the vines, and the carved furniture from her childhood. Trotsky was older, tired, but still magnetic. Frida, curious as always, began spending time with him. Their flirtation turned physical. It didn't last long, and neither of them mistook it for something more than it was, a collision of intellect and loneliness. Diego found out and responded with a fury that ignored his own trail of infidelities, and boy, had he left that trail everywhere. There were women in every city, models, assistants, actresses, women from the political circles they moved through, and women who posed for no one. He was careless with their names, but careful with his own need. The most painful, perhaps, was Christina, Frida's younger sister. That betrayal tore something loose in her, not just because it was close, but because it came with silence. Neither of them confessed. She found out in the way women often do, through shifts in body language, pauses in conversation, the empty space between two people suddenly made visible. The pain didn't undo her, but it did change how she chose to belong to him. And after that, nothing was sacred, and maybe nothing needed to be. Frida was no longer interested in justifying herself. She moved out briefly, rented a small apartment elsewhere in the city, and kept painting. Diego begged her to come back, and she did, but of course on her own terms. The years that followed were layered with love, resentment, intimacy, and distance. They were never stable, but they didn't break. Their marriage became quietly rearranged. A spot for betrayal front and centre, but a special loyalty lingered and grew potent. Diego understood her talent. He supported her work. She understood his volatility, and she tolerated more than most would have. Neither of them were saints, but then again, neither wanted to be. Her work grew bolder. In 1939, she was invited to exhibit in Paris, her first international solo show. André Breton, one of the fathers of surrealism, had seen her paintings in Mexico and declared her one of them. Frida didn't agree. She wasn't dreaming, she wasn't escaping logic or composing fantasy, but painting what she lived. The symbolism she used wasn't subconscious, it was deliberate. In Paris, she found herself both celebrated and misunderstood. The surrealists were amused by her, delighted by her. Primitivism, fascinated by her refusal to flatter their egos. She attended dinners where everyone wanted to talk about the exotic and the divine. She talked about ulcers and taxes. She hated the pretension. She hated how they used her image as proof of their own sophistication. Still, the exhibition did matter. The Louvre acquired one of her paintings, the frame, the first work by a 20th century Mexican artist to enter its collection. She left Paris with a mixture of satisfaction and contempt. She had no desire to return. Back in Mexico, her health was unraveling. The accident had never stopped echoing. Her spine was now deteriorating, and her right foot was developing infections. She spent more and more time in bed and sometimes painted from there. Other times, she simply stared at the ceiling, measuring her breath. But even in her decline, she remained vivid. She threw parties where she could, hosted students, musicians, and visiting radicals. She wore gold earrings and blood-red lipstick, dressed herself each day with full attention, even when she could barely walk. She refused to become invisible. Her work, once again in this period, changed. It became less decorative and more brutal. The two Fridas, painted in 1939, showed her doubled, one heart exposed and bleeding, and the other whole. The hands clasped between them, and the veins were cut and spilling. By this time, she had loved many people. There were women, lovers, confidants, woven through the margins of her life. Some were artists, although names were never spoken aloud. Her love didn't arrive with declarations. It moved, like everything else in her world, instinctively, intensely, and with its own logic. What remained constant was her desire to make sense of her own image. She painted to see herself more clearly, even if it hurt. By the early 40s, Frida's body began to decline in ways that she couldn't ignore. Her spine, damaged beyond repair, had started to collapse in on itself. Her right foot, which had been a long source of pain, developed gangrene. There were ulcers, infections, and nerve damage. Painkillers had stopped working in the way they used to. Alcohol blurred things for a while, but eventually stopped helping too. She had lived with pain for most of her life. It wasn't new, but it had never been this constant. It narrowed her days and shortened her sentences. Movement returned back to that same negotiation. And yet she continued to paint and teach. She continued to write letters that were funny, brutal, and sometimes unreadable from the strength of her handwriting alone. When she couldn't stand, she painted sitting. When she couldn't sit, she painted lying down. When she couldn't paint, she watched the light move across the walls and imagined what she would do when it returned. Her physical world grew smaller, but by contrast, Her voice grew louder. The 40s brought a kind of recognition she hadn't expected. Mexican artists and critics began to speak about her work as something essential. She was finally being given accolades independent of Diego and no longer seen as merely a decorative emblem or curiosity, something political, unique, and unrepeatable. She began teaching at La Esmeralda, the National School of Painting and Sculpture. She arrived dressed in layers of colour, a cigarette in one hand, her body braced by corsets and straps. Her students adored her. They called themselves Los Fridos. Some followed her home and never really left. She didn't teach technique. She taught the need for truth, the need to paint, not what was seen, but what was lived. Her teaching style favoured personal philosophy, not something that can be taught without the lived experience Frida herself had weathered. Her home became an extension of that vision. La Casa Azul was never quiet. Dogs, parrots, lovers, students, friends. Diego, when he was around. The rooms filled with music and cooking, and the clatter of politics and small errands. There was always someone sleeping on the couch, someone hanging a painting, or writing a poem that would never be finished. She still wore colour every day, embroidered dresses, layers of beads, silk ribbons in her hair. These ensembles held her together. Some mornings, she had to be lifted out of bed. Still, she dressed as if she were hosting a revolution. There were days she didn't speak, days when everything felt swollen. She became irritable with Diego and with her body, and sometimes with the people who adored her most. The pain left her raw, but she apologized when she could, and she gave what she had left. Her work, again, had evolved. It wasn't about experimentation anymore, but more about testimony. Her 1944 painting, The Broken Column, shows her body split open, her spine replaced with a crumbling architectural shaft, and nails embedded into her skin. Tears ran down her face, but her eyes didn't look away. It's a self-portrait, but it could also be read as a diagram and a study in endurance. In private, she was quieter. Letters to friends turned more introspective. She wrote often to Dr. Leo Eloesa, a trusted physician and friend in San Francisco. In her letters, she asked about treatments, but also about life and about art. She wanted to know what people were reading, what they thought of her work, and what they thought of her. Some of the writing during this time was dark. She talked about death often, but without fear. She didn't romanticize it either, but just kept it nearby. She still made jokes that made people shift in their chairs, and still told stories that held more truth than politeness allowed. But the proximity of an ending, physical, emotional, artistic, had become part of her everyday language. Her relationship with Diego shifted again. There was less drama now, less breaking and returning. A more consistent rhythm had formed. He still loved her. That much was visible. And in his way, he still depended on her for direction and grounding, for the kind of intimacy that couldn't be found in his flings. She didn't expect monogamy anymore, but in return, she quietly demanded presence. When he wasn't travelling, they shared meals, they laughed and thought about art. Sometimes they worked in the same room in silence. Sometimes she read aloud, and when he grew quiet for too long, she would insult him just to wake him up. He'd respond in kind. It worked. Her diaries from this time are full of half-finished thoughts, doodles, political slogans, descriptions of dreams, and lists of medications. Pages where the handwriting collapses and then starts again in another colour. She spoke more often and more publicly about class, about imperialism, and about Mexico's place in the world. The politics in her work had always been present. She painted brown skin with reverence. She painted pain without apology, and herself as evidence. In 1946, she was awarded a national prize for her painting, Moses, also known as The Sun and Life. It was a strange, crowded image, part religious, part biological, and part cosmic. This confused many critics but left a strong impression. She said she painted it after reading Freud, but the interpretation didn't matter, the impact did. The painting was alive, and so was she. Her health continued to worsen, of course. Surgeries followed one another without rest, each recovery harder than the last. Her leg, eventually, was amputated below the knee. The infection had gone too far. She called the prosthetic her wooden leg with a red boot. She painted it, adorned it, and still made it part of her body. By then, she knew she was dying, and she was determined to remain visible until the end. In 1953, Frida Kahlo had her first solo exhibition in Mexico. It was long overdue. She had shown work across the US and in Europe, but never alone on her own soil. The gallery was in Mexico City, a modern space with polished floors and clean walls. Her paintings hung quietly, waiting. Frida was in the hospital at the time. A recent operation had gone badly, and her doctors told her she wouldn't be able to attend. But her friends told her it was fine, that everyone would understand. But she didn't want understanding. She wanted a fiery pursuit towards a solution that meant she would be there. So, she arrived in an ambulance. They carried her in on a stretcher and placed her bed in the centre of the gallery. She wore a long pink dress and a crown of flowers. Her hair was braided and lips painted red. She drank tequila and told stories whilst musicians played. Her paintings looked down from the walls while she lay beneath them. Not as a patient or victim. She was a host. That night became part of her mythology. The paintings were not retrospective, but new. She had continued to work despite everything, despite the amputation, exhaustion, the long stretches of nausea and numbness. Her colours remained vivid too, the lines precise. Some works were filled with rage, and others careful grief. Her political voice grew louder as well. She attended protests in a wheelchair, her arms raised in solidarity with striking workers, artists, and students. She wrote letters to newspapers, signed petitions, hosted activists at her home. The pain didn't lessen, but the work never stopped. That year, she painted Marxism Will Give Health to the Sick. In it, Frida stands with braces around her torso, arms outstretched, as Marx's ghostly figure hovers behind her. She is protected and held upright. Around her, skeletal hands of capitalism and war are pushed back. The symbolism was blunt, but the politics explicit. Critics found the painting clumsy and too literal. Others dismissed it as sentimental and too far from her earlier work. But Frida didn't mind. She wasn't chasing praise, because her work had always been about survival, and this was no different. At home, things were fragile. Diego had grown quieter, older, and perhaps more reflective. Their arguments had softened into something closer to routine, and they knew each other too well to be cruel for long. Too much had passed between them to pretend it couldn't be uncomplicated. And of course, Frida still loved him, and in his own way, Diego her. There was still infidelity, there always had been, but the betrayals no longer broke anything open. They were weather systems they both knew how to read. Frida had other lovers too, and she didn't explain herself, or believe she should have to. Their marriage, at that point, was less about romance than ritual. He brought her brushes, and she corrected his Spanish. They argued about revolution and listened to records in silence. They were still, somehow, the centre of each other's lives. There were constant visitors, artists, writers, and students who would hover in the kitchen or wander through the garden. Some came for advice, and others just to be near her. Many stayed too long. She didn't always mind, but some days she needed quiet. Other days, she needed the house and the noise to drown everything else out. Her home remained full of colour, terracotta walls, cobalt floors, and shelves stacked with papier-mâché skeletons. Her bed had a mirror mounted above it. Her studio arranged with discipline. She kept her paints in a cigar box. Her brushes were cleaned, pencils sharpened. She wore rings on almost every finger. There were some days that she couldn't eat, and days that she couldn't stand. Her weight dropped significantly, and the pain pulsed through her hips, shoulders, and ribs. Still, she found small ways to reach outward. A letter, a joke, a new piece of work, half finished and drying by the window. She had never expected to live this long, and now that she was nearing the end of her life, she found herself holding tightly to small rituals. The taste of tamarind, the feeling of beads against her collarbone, the way paper flowers never wilted. Her diaries from these months shift between clarity and chaos. There are entries where her thoughts unfurl with precision. Others trail off mid-sentence or dissolve into drawings. One page is filled with the words, "I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return." It was dated shortly before her death. The last month of Frida Kahlo's life were marked by attention. Visitors continued to fill the house, both invited and impromptu. She still kept up with letters, the news, with whatever Diego had left scattered around the breakfast table. There were mornings when she could barely lift her head, and yet still wanted to know what the party was doing, who was marching, what murals were being commissioned, and what people were saying. Her pain still constant. It now shaped everything. The infection in her leg returned in waves. Her torso had to be bound each morning to keep her upright. Even breathing took a considerable amount of work. Sleep came in fragments. But none of this dimmed her insistence on being part of the world. When people came to visit, she still wore colour, red lipstick, earrings shaped like hands. Her voice was hoarser now, and her laugh more like a breath than a sound. But she was still sharp as ever, still irreverent, capable of catching a guest off guard with a comment they'd think about for days. She had a way of being tender and brutal at once. This hadn't faded at all. The house became a site of care. Nurses, friends, cousins. students who stayed long after the lesson was over. Someone was always heating water, adjusting cushions, and wiping down the metal of her bed frame. Her belongings stayed just in their place, just where she liked them, and her paints remained organized. Her brushes pointed upward in their jars. She painted when she could, small pieces, loose watercolors, a self-portrait with her hair loose and eyes wide, another with Diego painted into the center of her forehead. Some were unfinished, and a few were given away. One she kept beside her bed and wouldn't speak about. She had stopped explaining what things meant. The last painting she completed was a still life. Viva la vida. Watermelons in sharp colour, some split open, and seeds visible. She signed it in red paint across the flesh of the fruit. It didn't carry metaphor, nor did it need to. There was vitality in the act alone. That summer, her health worsened rapidly. She was admitted to the hospital again in July and taken home soon after, because there was little that could be done, and she knew this too. So did everyone around her. On the 13th of July, 1954, Frida Kahlo died in La Casa Azul. She was 47. Her death certificate listed a pulmonary embolism. Some suspected an overdose. The rumours followed, but no one close to her was interested in dissecting the ending. There had been enough dissection already. Her body was taken to the Palacio de Bellas Artes. Thousands came. Some threw flowers, others raised their fist. Her coffin was draped in a red flag with a hammer and sickle. Diego stood nearby, pale and unreadable. He would later say it was the most painful day of his life. The funeral was held with full honours, but it was the gathering outside, the friends, students, neighbours, vendors and musicians that felt more like her. People spoke loudly. They drank, they wept, they told stories and hung paintings. They argued about art and revolution. In the weeks that followed, Diego returned to the blue house. He kept it just as she had left it. The bed, the mirror, the brushes. He asked that nothing be changed. He said the house was still hers, and he would only live in it as a guest. It would remain that way until his death 3 years later. There was no instant canonization. Her work wasn't immediately elevated. For a while, her paintings were remembered as Diego's wife's. Interesting, but peripheral. Her diaries were boxed up, her dresses stored, her letters passed around informally, and many lost. For years, her name floated around without anchor. For a while, Frida Kahlo was remembered quietly. Her paintings remained, but they were kept mostly in private collections or hung in corners of museums, alongside labels that mentioned Diego's name first. A few critics spoke about her, but they used small words. The house in Coyoacán stayed closed to the public. Diego made sure of that. He wanted it preserved and held in place. He kept her dresses, her corsets, her letters and sketches, even her pain medications lined up in the bathroom, and the mirror still fixed to the canopy of the bed. When he died in 1957, he left instructions for the house to eventually become a museum, but only after time had passed. It wasn't until the 1970s that her work began to creep towards the international, critically acclaimed status we know it to be today. The feminist movement found her first. Women who had seen too many male painters talk about the female body turned towards Frida instead, a woman who painted from inside of it. Her diaries were then published. Her letters circulated more widely. Scholars looked again. They saw discipline, the theory beneath the colour, and the structure behind the emotion. In Mexico, she was no longer just Diego's wife. She was becoming something else, a national figure, and a symbol of creative resistance. Her face began to appear more often in student posters, in articles, and in classrooms. The Tijuana dress, the eyebrows, the gaze that never turned away. By the 80s, her paintings were being exhibited around the world, and collectors began seeking them out. Galleries reassessed their archives. Museums wanted her works on the walls and not in storage. The two Fridas, self-portrait with thorn necklace and a hummingbird, the broken column, the blue house opened to the public in 1958. People walked the same tiles she had walked. They saw the easel she painted from, the mirrors, the brushes, the plaster corsets, the unfinished sketches. Her ashes placed in a toad-shaped urn, a private reference to Diego, and kept on display in her bedroom. The walls stayed blue, and the plants kept growing. In the years that followed, her image was being lifted and repeated in ways she could never have predicted. She became a symbol of independence, of suffering, queerness, of femininity, of strength and of pain. There were murals of her in cities she had never visited, documentaries, retrospectives, fashion lines, coffee mugs, books about her handwriting, essays about her eyebrows, arguments about her meaning. Some tried to claim her, others tried to define her, but her work never allowed it. Frida Kahlo's paintings don't seek resolution. They don't flatter the viewer. They hold their shape, a body, a face, a truth, all opened, exposed, and held without apology. She never wanted to be understood, nor did she ask. But she refused to be ignored. In the last decade, her presence has only deepened. Frida's image returned with new weight in the 2010s. Younger generations found their own language in hers. She appeared across social media, in art schools and in protests. Her influence moved through drag, through fashion and scholarship. In 2026, the Tate will open a new exhibition dedicated entirely to her work. It will include early sketches, unseen letters, and rarely shown paintings. This will be a chance to view her not through myth, but through her process. This is evidence of the infinite mystery and admiration Frida Kahlo's name continues to hold hundreds of years on from her first musings on canvas. Even now, she appears where you don't expect her. In protests, in makeup campaigns, in quiet bedrooms, in university lectures, secondhand bookstores, tattoos, language. Frida Kahlo remains. She chose to be visible in the exact moments the world wanted her to disappear.